Okay, so in the last video for this chapter on technology, production, and costs, what I want to focus a bit more on is this long-run decision. So the previous video had ended with this idea that there were a bunch of short-run curves that the producer could choose among, but that there was sort of an enveloping function that formed the lower boundary of all those short-run cost curves. In the appendix to this chapter, an appendix that I want you to read, and it's also covered in the typed up notes, I want to take a different attack on this notion of long-run production, long-run costs. And it's going to be rather similar to what we did in chapter 9. So, what we have here is this idea that we're going to have isoquants, which are going to be similar to the indifference curve. And we're going to have isocost curves, which are going to be similar to the budget constraint. So this is going to be the production or the firm's equivalent of the indifference curve. This is going to be the firm's equivalent of the budget constraint that we had for the consumer. So basically what we're saying is that since this is a long-run description, that there are two goods that now a firm can purchase, just as consumers could choose to pick two goods to consume. Firms in the long run have variability in both capital and in labor. And now, in terms of the isoquant, the quantity is now going to be fixed. Now, obviously, these quantities are cardinal numbers. The numbers actually mean something relative to each other, right? That this is 20% more production than this. You couldn't do that with utility numbers because those were ordinal. These are cardinal quantities, and we would say that these are all the combinations of capital and labor that give us an output of 100 units. These are all the combinations of capital and labor that give us output of 120. Now, the slope of this is called the MRTS, the marginal rate of technical substitution. What it's measuring here is the marginal productivity of the input on the x-axis over the marginal productivity of the input on the y-axis. In this case, it would be the marginal productivity of labor over the marginal productivity of capital, where the MPL is simply a measure of how much additional production we get by having additional labor units. Okay, so what we can see here is that as we read this from left to right, that the marginal rate of technical substitution is falling. Now, let's look at a situation where we have points 1, 2, and 3. You'll notice that at points 1, 2, and 3, right, we have the same amount of production of 100 units. But the firm, since it's trying to minimize its costs, it's going to want to pick a combination of labor and capital that allows it to get the cheapest way of producing 100 units, which would be achieved at point 2. Now, these lines that I've drawn here are isocost curves. The isocost curve would basically say that for a budget of, let's say, $15,000, how much, what are the combinations of labor and capital that I could afford? Drawing this out a little bit bigger here, I have my isoquant, where the slope is the marginal rate of technical substitution. And they now have my ISO cost curves, where the budget is constant and the slope is equal to the wage rate over the rental rate of capital, W over R, or alternatively, the price of labor over the price of capital. So price of capital is often considered little r, the rental rate. Price of labor is considered W, the wage rate. And you can see that for points 1, 2, and 3, if I'm a firm and I need to produce 100 units of stuff, I would be best off at point 2, right? Because that would be a way that I could produce 100 units of stuff, of output, at the cheapest cost. You'll notice that at point 2, that the price ratio is equal to the marginal rate of technical substitution. Or alternatively, that at point 2, that W over R, that W over R is equal to the price of labor over the price of capital is equal to the ratio of the marginal productivities. Or, to take this a little bit further, that at point 2, I'm just going to draw this out again here, labor, capital, that MPL over W is going to be equal to MPK over R. That basically, similar to the optimal decision for the consumer, that from the firm's perspective, they are maximizing production at minimal cost at the point where the marginal productivity per dollar spent is equal across the two input goods. That if they were instead at this point 1, at this point 1, what's happening is that the MPL over MPK is greater than the W over R. And I know that to be the case because the slope of this isoquant, right, if I were to draw a line of tangency, is steeper than this isocost curve. And if that's the case, I basically have labor that's not as productive, right? Now, capital that's not as productive. So in that case, what would I do? I would buy more labor. As I buy more labor, the labor becomes less productive. I buy more labor, so I'm going to start to move this direction. As I buy more labor, the marginal productivity of labor would fall. Just as similar to the consumer, the wage rate and the rental rate do not change. What changes is the marginal productivities based on how much of that input I use. Okay, so then from the firm's perspective, just as was the case from the consumer's perspective, the goal here is to understand how the firm can minimize its expenditures, and it does that by fulfilling this condition where the marginal productivity per dollar spent is equal across the two inputs. Okay, so that concludes this chapter 10, and it really concludes the heart of what really constitutes microeconomic theory. What we're going to do in the last 2 chapters for this section is we're going to focus on now types of firms. And we're going to do 2 extremes here. We're going to look first at perfect competition, which is really just a theoretical construct not really relevant to reality, but then we're going to turn to something that's a bit more realistic, called monopolistic competition. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video here, and then we're going to pick it up with a discussion of what constitutes a perfectly competitive firm.